Hello, everybody. Glad you could join me today. Let's talk about language. As I've made clear to you, I practice Neuro-Linguistic Programming, or N.L.P. To extremely oversimplify things, it's all about communication and change. So let's break down the title and understand it a little better. Neuro refers to the brain. However, as anyone who studies medicine will tell you, the brain isn't the only part with that kind of label. You have the whole nervous system, you have neurology. And of course, you can't have a nervous system without the rest of the body, and you can't have a functioning body without a nervous system. So, in a sense, it refers to the whole body. By the way, Deepak Chopra apparently has said that every single cell in our bodies is bathed with what's called a neurotransmitter of some kind. So it receives messages from the nerves and gives messages to the nerves. Anyway, linguistic refers to language, but let's be honest here too. It's more like all communication. After all, according to some figures, major communication differences happen 7% of the time through actual language, 38% of the time from the sound of your voice, and 55% of the time from nonverbal communication. While that study happens to be more about incongruities in communication during extreme emotional excitation, it's easy to see how it works in the world around you. Consider your own name. When your parents would say it, you could tell that they wanted your attention from your name alone. You could tell whether it was something pleasant or unpleasant based on the tone of their voice. What really got the message across was how they looked and moved. Another way to look at it is like this. Deaf people can tell what you want with them if you happen to know American Sign Language. They can't tell much by what you say, but they can read lips, facial expressions, posture, movements, etc. And of course, blind people can tell what you want by the sound of your voice and the words you say. But how hard is it to tell when someone is being facetious online by just the tone of what they type? Then you have programming, perhaps the most contested term of the whole thing, which refers not to manipulating people by programming them like a computer, but how you function, both automatically and with thought. While this is connected to your neurology, it's not the same thing. If we're going by the analogy of a computer system, neuro refers to the hardware of the system, while programming refers to the software. And as a Christian, I personally believe that just like software is immaterial, so is the mind. In fact, the mind could be called the soul, as in, and God breathed into him the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Communication, of course, refers to the passing of information through various media. Ancient Greek philosophers, learning from the civilizations that came before in their own analyses of their personal observations, believed in 5 main sources, or modalities, of senses. Today, scientists tell us that there are 26, but they all still relate in one way or another to the 5 senses of sight, or visual, sound or auditory, touch or kinesthetic, smell or olfactory, and taste, gustatory, and the various qualities of these senses which we have, which we call submodalities. We receive information through all of these senses we have, and that is a form of communication. Since our first learnings are based on what we observe around how the world works around us, we know that our mind works based on metaphors about the world around us. You know how you can actually feel your mind filling up with information? That's a metaphor. And when it comes to what we learn, our mind takes in millions and billions of chunks of information at any given moment. But we can only unconsciously take in 134 chunks. And we narrow those 134 chunks down to between 5 and 9 chunks consciously. How do we do that? We delete or get rid of some of the information we decide isn't important. We distort some information we decide needs to be understood from a different perspective. And we generalize what we learn so it applies to a lot of different scenarios. In fact, if we didn't generalize things, we couldn't hardly function. Imagine having to study every door handle you encountered, just because they're all so different in so many ways. Knowing all of this, there are all kinds of ways to communicate, and deletion, distortion, and generalization are ways in which we do communicate. After all, the map is not the territory. What we experience is just a facsimile of the real world around us, much like how a map only gives you a useful way to get around town and is not the town itself. Generalization helps us connect things together to find out how one thing relates to another. Deletion helps us avoid paying attention to things we don't need to know at the time, even though things we consciously delete can still be in our unconscious minds, and things we generalize can have details specific to them in our unconscious minds. Distortion changes what we experience, even though some things may remain clear in our unconscious minds. But these three ways of filing away information can be used to manipulate too. You can generalize things together that don't link. You can distort perspectives on things to make them inaccurate. And you can both miss out on things that require your attention and have things running in the background of your mind that affect how you think consciously as well as unconsciously. Remember that next time you encounter a commercial or some kind of propaganda. Now, there is another way to communicate, a sort of sixth sense, if you will. That's called auditory digital, or the use of language. Language can be deleted, distorted, and generalized as well. Knowing this, Richard Bandler was able to unconsciously copy the linguistic techniques of Fritz Perls and Virginia Satir, and John Grinder was able to decode them in understandable ways. There are certain ways people speak to themselves which keep them in a trance state. By bringing back deleted information, clarifying distorted information, and specifying generalized information, you can break someone out of a trance so that they find multiple different options for behavior. By copying and decoding the techniques of Milton Erickson, they were also able to find ways that people can put each other into trances and stop them from thinking too deeply about things, which involved many other techniques not seen in their original model. By catching these techniques in use and decoding them for others to understand better, we can reveal to them the tricks being used on them, help them come back from the trance they're in with those tricks, with those techniques working on them, and teach them what to look for in the future so they automatically see what's being thrown at them, inoculating them from the effect. These models of language are known as the meta model and the Milton model. The meta model after the work of Virginia Satir for the model that is language, and the Milton model after Milton Erickson, which is a model of hypnotic language. Of course, tone of voice and nonverbal communication, as well as communication through the other senses, all contribute to hypnotic techniques. Every level must be explained and dissected. But for now, I've given you a lot of information on what to look for in the hypnotic communication of other sensory modalities and submodalities. We're going to start with the meta-model violations. Knowing these will help you get from the surface structure of language to the deep structure, which is a map of the experience itself. First, you have the deletions. The first is the simple deletion. It involves a deletion of information. Pretty simple, right? An example is, I'm scared. The challenge question would be something like, about what specifically? You'll notice that a lot of basic N.L.Pers use the word specifically a lot, and ironically, a lot of the highly advanced N.L.Pers use it a lot too. That's because specific information gets you out of the trance. Second, you have the unspecified referential index. It involves a statement where the person, place, thing, etc. is referenced, but unspecified. An example is, people say only fools rush in. The challenge question would be something like, who specifically says that? Third, you have the unspecified verb. This is where a verb, by the way, unspecified referential index is also known as an unspecified noun. Anyway, third, you have the unspecified verb. This is where a verb is given, but it is not specified how the verb is being used. An example is, we need to communicate. The challenge question would be something like, how specifically are we communicating? Fourth, you have the comparative deletion. This is where a comparison is made, but what is being compared to what is being deleted. An example is, my grandmother says things were better back then. The challenge question would be something like, better than what specifically? And fifth, you have a nominalization. Now, this one is pretty complicated. A nominalization is a verb that has been turned into a noun and has frozen the action by making it a thing. A good rule of thumb is, if you can't imagine putting it in a wheelbarrow, you have a nominalization. An example is, my depression is getting worse. And you'll notice a lot of nominalizations, the more effective ones end with something like ION, or in this case, like depression. The challenge question would be something like, how specifically are you depressing yourself? Now, here's a pro tip. To make it more effective, you want to add the action back into the verb, usually by adding the suffix ing or ing at the end of the verb. This also helps you find more options so you're no longer metaphorically and linguistically stuck. Next, you have the distortions. The first is mind reading. This is also a fallacy, acting like you know what someone is thinking, even without evidence or with evidence to the contrary. An example is, you don't care about me. The challenge question would be something like, how specifically would you know whether I cared about you or not? Second, you have cause-effect statements. These are statements that connect two things, with one as the cause to the other's effect. An example is, this deadline is stressing everyone out. The challenge question would be something like, what specifically is the connection between this deadline and everyone's feeling of stress? Or you could use something like, how specifically does this deadline cause you to choose to feel stressed out? That one is a subtle dig that can change how one perceives the relationship between two things. Ideally and generally, rather than being at effect for things in your life, your response is being caused by them. You want to be a cause for things in your life. This gives you the chance to think of all kinds of options. Third, you have complex equivalence statements. These are statements that equate one thing with another, often by using or implying terms like is, means, or to be. It's related to cause-effect statements, but different in that the one thing doesn't cause the other. They're connected or related. An example is, I didn't get the job. I'm not good enough. Notice the implied that means between the two statements. The challenge question would be something like, how specifically does your not getting the job mean that you're not good enough? Then you have the generalizations. The first is the universal quantifier. This is also known as all or nothing thinking or painting with a broad brush, which is a logical fallacy. In fact, you'll find that a lot of these can be logical fallacies or cognitive biases. Anyway, this usually is reflected by terms that are very general in scope. All, nothing, etc. An example is, you always do that to me. The challenge question would be something like, always? Or something more detailed like, has there ever been an exception in all of time and space? Second, you have modal operators. These are modes of operation. However, they come in four types. First is the modal operator of possibility, which you can tell by statements like can. The second is the modal operator of impossibility, which you can tell by statements like cannot or can't. The third is the modal operator of necessity, which you can tell by statements like must. The last one is the modal operator of desire, which you can tell by statements like want to. Interestingly enough, need to is a modal operator of necessity, but the way it's used can make it seem like a modal operator of desire depending on the emphasis. An example is, I have to meet this deadline. The challenge question would be something like, or, and of course you could also use the more elegant, what would happen if you did, or what would happen if you didn't. In fact, there in master practitioner level trainings, there are types of language called quantum linguistics. Part of that includes Cartesian coordinates. And you have, for example, I'm trying to think of what they are. You have the verse, which is something like, what would happen if you did? Then you have the reverse, which is, what would happen if you didn't? And someone who knows better than I do, please put it in the comments. But then you have the converse, which is, what wouldn't happen if you did? Then you have the non-mirror image reverse, which is, what wouldn't happen if you didn't? And these are all designed not to destroy the problem, but to loosen up your thinking so that you can see other alternatives, other options. The third is the presupposition. Presupposition. I've been doing this for quite a few minutes, as you can tell. And it's as a generalization. There are a lot of different kinds of presuppositions, and I'll let you look them up on your own if you want to. You can definitely tell that something is a presupposition in that you have to presuppose it's true for the statement to make sense. An example is, the cat sat on the mat. In this statement, certain things are implied. There must be a cat, for example, and a mat. The challenge question would be something like, can you prove that's true? Or if you want to be gentle with it, what would things be like if it wasn't that way? Since a statement may have more than one meta-model violation, you should figure out which violation really sets the tone for the whole message. That's the one you tackle first and foremost. And honestly, these are all very basic ways of dealing with meta-model violations. They were introduced first in the Structure of Magic Parts 1 and 2, when Bandler and Grinder had first brought them forth to the whole world. And since then, they've actually come up with a technique during training in which people who use these types of comebacks, these types of questions, will have to bark them out like they're barking dogs. Because barking is a reflex for dogs. And these kinds of questions become a reflex for us and are handling it inelegantly or kind of brute forcing it. So, what that means is when you ask these questions, you have to be a little bit more subtle, a little bit more elegant with them if you want to avoid losing the other person. In fact, John Grinder taught them to a class one time, and the class came back and said that everybody that had been in their lives no longer wanted to be part of their lives because they had been meta-modeled to death, basically. And that was called being a meta-monster. But my point is, figuring out the implications of these meta-model violations can help you ask questions that really get to the deep structure. But this isn't really a post about how to get to the deep structure of things. It's a post about how to spot a grift. a con, a bamboozle, a flim-flam, a trick. You see what I'm saying here? Now, the first Milton model pattern we're going to cover, because the Milton model covers meta-model violations being deliberate, and part of the use of the meta-model to put people into a trance. The second part covers language patterns that are specific and unique to the Milton model. So the first Milton model pattern we're going to cover is embedded suggestions. This is a way of sneaking information into the unconscious mind by somehow marking it out, or analog marking, part of a statement. To your conscious mind, it's a whole statement. To your unconscious mind, there's a part that must become your focus, and you will accept it uncritically. Analog marking, of course, was the second technique. The third is the conversational postulate. That's where you pose a question in the conversation. In this case, it's literally a yes or no question, but you automatically respond to it with an action of some sort. And by the way, I'll also point out that there are embedded questions. These are questions that are phrased as statements that have a similar effect to the conversational postulate. The fourth is the tag question. This is the inclusion of a question with a negative or affirmative, whichever would be the opposite of a statement, designed to get you to agree with the statement and disagree with the opposite of the statement. It's a method of pre-framing, which is a way of changing the narrative before someone else can bring up the narrative themselves. That way you inoculate them against it. Framing is a high-level N.L.P technique and concept that you can learn through books like L. Michael Hall's Frame Games, which was actually written, I believe, by L. Michael Hall and Bobby G. Bodenhamer. Two very well-known, well-respected, but somewhat controversial figures in N.L.P because they tend to put their own spin on things. For example, L. Michael Hall actually expanded the meta model, it would seem at the request of Dr. Richard Bandler, and came up with, I think, 9 more metamodel techniques or violations from semantics and cognitive sciences. Anyway, getting back on topic, the fifth is the bind. There are actually 2 types. There are regular binds, which narrow your decision down between 2 or more choices, but leave open a series of options that don't fit the narrative. The second type, double binds, involve the inclusion of all available options, all leading to the same desired conclusion. The sixth is the extended quote. This is where you tell a story, usually with someone making a statement. Since you're not the one making the statement yourself, but you're just saying that someone else is, it's easier to accept. The seventh is the selectional restriction violation. I know that's a mouthful, isn't it? This is a violation of a selection's restriction. For example, the statement, and this is a classic one from Dr. Milton Erickson, and a tomato can be happy. You know tomatoes don't have feelings, so what is this? It's a kind of metaphor which causes you to accept that something could be true about you. The eighth is the negation. This is actually a problem for the mind because the mind doesn't unconsciously process negatives. The only exception to the rule is the negative can't. It is understood as being able to do the process of not doing something. By using the negation, someone can cause you to paradoxically do what they want you to do while retaining the plausible deniability of it being a negative. Don't think about negations until you are willing to learn more about them. See how that works? The ninth is the metaphor, analogy, or story. The reason this works is the same reason the extended quote and selectional restriction violation work. In fact, the extended quotes and the selectional restriction violation are actually part of metaphors. The 10th is the open and nested loop. The open loop takes advantage of something known as the Zeigarnik effect, in which telling a story and leaving a cliffhanger keeps people invested in the story. Nested loops involve telling multiple stories with open ends, giving a statement meant to be absorbed uncritically by the mind while you're in a confused and trance with so many cliffhangers, and then closing off the stories one by one or all at once. This has the added effect of amnesia in some people. The 11th is pacing current experience. This involves a technique called pacing and leading, the agreement set, which is we'll get into in a minute, and utilization. Pacing is simply establishing rapport with someone, which means finding ways to emphasize similarities with them to make a connection in their mind. Leading is going from following someone else's lead in being the same to setting the trend yourself. The agreement set, excuse me, the agreement set is either asking questions or making statements that elicit either yeses, nos, or a combination of the two. This is also about establishing rapport or pacing and leading. And then you have utilization. It's another form of pacing which involves taking whatever someone says and agreeing with it to turn it around into something you want it to do, as all meaning is context dependent. And you can establish rapport, pace, and lead through nonverbal techniques and vocal qualities, through all of the five senses, in fact. Of course, we can't stop here. Here's just a word about reframing. All meaning is context dependent. As long as you have a context that fits the situation, you can reframe anything to mean anything. Change the content of the message or the context it fits in, and you change the meaning. By using rapport and pacing and leading, one can get someone else to accept reframing. One can also get someone to accept reframing with a sudden jarring sensation to the system. A shock, if you will. Not something major, but a minor surprise. And humor does this very well, in fact. Humor is all about reframing. That's why comedy has such a powerful effect. I will finally touch on fractionation. By putting someone into a trance and bringing them out of it multiple times in a row, you can get them to go deeper and deeper each time. And this is also all part of how crowds are manipulated, according to George Estabrooks, a great hypnotist of the last century who was on par with Dr. Erickson and was a professor of psychology at Colgate University as Dr. Erickson was studying and developing his reputation. Estabrooks, who also worked on the MK Ultra project very briefly and previous projects leading up to it, trying to discover ways to use hypnosis to get people to do what they normally wouldn't do, was able to get people to do things that approached directly would be impossible to get them to do under hypnosis. And he wrote in his book Hypnotism about how crowds can be manipulated. There are 5 steps: emotional contagion, restricting the field of consciousness, also known as focusing, social sanction, also known as rapport, a feeling of omnipotence or encouragement, and finally, the removal of inhibitions. By now, you should know how easy it is to manipulate people. So, how do you ultimately decide who gets access to your deeper self and who doesn't? Ask yourself, what's in it for them? What's in it for me? And what's in it for the future? Before I sign off on this video, I want to point out that the Bible is a book written by completely honest people at, well, completely honest in their writing, containing accurate information about real historical events and the mechanics of a healthy, honest system. You can measure anything up against the Bible and determine how much, and specifically how, it's a counterfeit based on where and how it deviates from the biblical message. From there, you can gauge intent and decide for yourself if you want to get sucked into a dangerous false system or not. I know this was a really long video, and I'm really glad you stuck with me through it all. I hope this gives you the edge over manipulators of all kinds. Good night, and God bless.